Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to discuss an incredibly important subject, our nation's budget deficits. The deficit for fiscal year 2009 was about $1.4 trillion. The total national debt is now just under $13.2 trillion. These numbers are staggering and represent a tremendous threat to our nation. Now, we've been hearing a lot about these numbers over the last few months from members on both sides of the aisle. We've heard about the economic dangers of running these deficits, the dangers to us, to our children, and to the very future of this nation. I share these concerns over the direction of our budget deficits and our rapidly growing debt. I've held these concerns for some time, as a matter of fact. In a New York Times op-ed way back in 1988, 22 years ago, I expressed my alarm that we had gone from being the world's largest creditor nation to its largest debtor nation. I noted then that the accumulated trade and budget deficits of the Reagan years worked out to about $20,000 per American family. What frustrates me is that I've heard these deficit and debt numbers serve as an excuse for not passing an extension of unemployment benefits. We've been unable to get cloture on these extensions despite spending weeks of the Senate's time on this matter and despite numerous attempts. Opponents say our deficits must be addressed. Our debt can't grow any larger. We've got to draw a line in the sand and insist that these benefits be fully paid for. This is troubling to me for two reasons. First, because these deficits aren't new, and many of my colleagues seem to have suddenly become aware of them only a year and a half ago. More importantly, I'm troubled because one of the biggest threats to our long-term deficits is a double-dip recession and the stunting of our nation's economic growth. And this short-sightedness is not only jeopardizing our short-term economic recovery and our future economic health, it's causing us to abandon the real and urgent needs of families at home in our states. So please indulge me as I take a few minutes to take stock of exactly where we find ourselves. You all know that our unemployment rate has been hovering at about 10%, its highest level in over a quarter of a century. There are 14.6 million Americans looking for jobs but unable to find them. Nearly half of these, our friends, family, and neighbors, have been out of work for over 6 months, despite sustained efforts to find jobs. Long-term unemployment is the worst that it's been in the 60 years that these statistics have been kept. You'd have to go back to 1983 to find numbers even half this bad. And the competition for each job is fierce. It's not uncommon for hundreds of people to be fighting for a single job posting. This chart shows just how hard it is to find work right now. In 2006, there were about 1.5 unemployed workers for each job opening. That number has exploded to 5 unemployed workers for every opening. So it doesn't surprise me that countless Americans have just given up looking and aren't even counted in the bleak unemployment statistics that I've been quoting. They've just given up. Now, I can't imagine many things more demoralizing than not being able to find work, not being able to take care of your family. I've heard the claim from one of my colleagues that unemployment insurance provides an incentive for the millions of unemployed to just sit on their duffs and not look for work. I couldn't disagree more strongly. Unemployment insurance doesn't keep people from working. A lack of jobs keeps people from working. I travel all over Minnesota talking to people who are out of work. I've gone to Anoka County Workforce Center. I go to union halls in Duluth and in Bemidji and Rochester, and I meet with folks who are literally depressed. These are people who've worked their whole lives. Guys who started their first paper route when they were 9 years old, or 10. And took pride in doing their jobs, even when it meant going out on a 30 below zero winter morning in Minnesota. And they've been working ever since. Work is an enormous part of their identity. These Minnesotans don't want an unemployment check, they want work. Still, I've had a number of them come and say to me, you know, if it weren't for my unemployment insurance, I wouldn't be in my house. One of my constituents wrote to me and said, I was employed for 23 years since college graduation, and now am in need of extended unemployment benefits as the economy slowly recovers via a, quote, jobless recovery. As a college graduate with an MBA and 23 years of continuous employment at, quote, good jobs, I never imagined even needing basic unemployment. As an active job seeker, I have met hundreds of other job seekers, and virtually every one of them wants a job and wants to work. Now, this constituent and thousands of others like him have to hear this junk about how unemployment insurance incentivizes people not to work. I don't know where the senators who are saying that are going in their state. But from what I've heard from my other colleagues, it's like this all over the country. But even if we ignore the human side of our economic crisis, even if we are to look only at what's best for our nation's economy, both in the short term and the long term, it is still the right answer to extend unemployment benefits and do so without offsetting them by cutting other important programs. Now, I'm not an economist, not many of us here are, but there happens to be a pretty convincing record for us to draw from. According to Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's Economy.com and a senior advisor to Senator McCain's presidential campaign, extending unemployment insurance benefits creates $1.63 in demand for every dollar spent. That's pretty stimulative. And it makes sense. Unemployment benefits are likely to be spent quickly and in local communities. Unemployed workers no longer get a paycheck, but they still have to pay their mortgage, and they still have to put food on the table, and they still have to pay their electric bills. Throughout this crisis, we've all heard from economist after economist who are closely watching the strength of consumer spending. Our economy rises and falls on it. Unemployment benefits support consumer spending and stimulate the economy. Like other automatic stabilizers, programs for which eligibility is triggered when the economy sinks and are used less as the economy recovers, unemployment benefits are effective and appropriate stimulus measures. You know what else is proven to work? Food stamps. $1.73 in yield for every dollar spent. General aid to state governments returns $1.38 on every dollar spent. That's why I've co-sponsored a bill with my friend from Ohio, Senator Brown, to deliver aid to states. The Local Jobs for America Act could save 1 million public sector jobs, the jobs of teachers, firefighters, police officers, child care workers. And of course, increased investment in our nation's infrastructure yields $1.59 for every dollar spent. Infrastructure spending repairs our crumbling bridges and roads to keep us competitive in the global marketplace. We could build our way out of this crisis just as we did after World War II with our interstate highway system. The 21st century version of the interstate highway system is our broadband network. Commerce is now highly dependent not just on bridges and roads, but on efficient communications. There's no small irony in the fact that we have fallen behind other countries in our access to the internet, a technology created by U.S. government research dollars and one which itself created so much wealth here in the United States and around the world. The Recovery Act has already invested $85 million in grants and $32 million in loans to expand broadband coverage in Minnesota. And that's a good thing, because the more parts of this country we can reach with the broadband network, the more people in our country that will be engaged in trade and in our economy. And this expansion can help reduce our nation's other deficit, the trade deficit. The President's export initiative, along with improving exchange rates and global economic growth, can contribute to boosting our exports. And that means more jobs, more growth, and reduced budget deficits. Our country has plenty to offer, especially as countries throughout the world transition to green economics and economies. In my home state, a National Science Foundation grant helped the University of Minnesota develop a technological breakthrough that will lead to an ultra-efficient solar cell. These cells can produce 60% more energy. We shouldn't be importing Chinese solar panels. We should be using this technology to develop our own, for our own use and for export. But all these things, unemployment benefits, infrastructure, research, they all cost money. They all require spending. And some of my colleagues seem to think that long-term deficit reduction and short-term spending are somehow incompatible. Take, for example, the Recovery Act. Yes, it added to our short-term deficit, perhaps. But imagine where our economy would be now if we hadn't enacted it. Now, I know some of my colleagues will say, well, the stimulus package was a failure. The President said that unemployment would hit 8% if we didn't enact the stimulus package, and unemployment has been near 10% for months. Well, yeah, but there are a couple possibilities here. Either the stimulus package was a failure, or the recession left by the Bush administration was even worse than his advisors thought it was when President Obama said that. When President Bush left office, we were bleeding jobs. We lost about 800,000 jobs in that last month of the Bush administration, about 750,000 the first month of President Obama's administration. We lost 4.4 million jobs in Bush's final year in office. Yet with the Recovery Act, the President has been able to turn the economy around and immediately stem the growing losses. The numbers of jobs lost got smaller and smaller each month, and this year we had 5 straight months of growth, and we created 882 net jobs this year. Does anyone see a trend line here? Now, some of you may point to this little negative bar here at the end. That's primarily a result of losing some temporary census jobs. But if you look at only the private sector, we actually saw a net increase in jobs in June. And imagine what this would look like without the Recovery Act. Last month, the CBO estimated that the Recovery Act has increased the number of people employed by 1.2 to 2.8 million. It is the view of many economists that but for the Recovery Act, we would have slipped into a depression. In that case, our deficit would actually be a lot higher than it is today, because that's what happens during a depression. Let's remember what was in the Recovery Act. Roughly a third went to state governments. Roughly a third went to tax cuts for 95% of Americans, and roughly a third went for infrastructure. Many of these projects are now coming online now. You know, I travel all over my state, and I talk to mayors and city planners and county commissioners, as I know the President does in your state of Alaska. And I talk to small business owners, and usually I don't know, nor do I particularly care, which political party they belong to. And almost invariably, they thank me for stimulus funds that finance the repair of an aging wastewater plant, or some cops or teachers, or funded worker training, or a home foreclosure counseling program that prevented homes from going into foreclosure, saving their communities money. Yes, local and state Republican office holders and small businessmen thank me for the Recovery Act. A lot. And I wasn't even here to vote for it. And still, they thank me. And you know what? After they thank me, they say more. They ask for more. We have an economic crisis on our hands. Congress should be making investments that provide the highest returns on investment and can be, at the same time, stimulative to our economy. Now is not the time to stop investing. Short-term shocks to the system will impair our economic recovery. We should simultaneously be looking for long-term budgetary solutions while continuing to invest in our recovering economy. These are not incompatible. In fact, I believe it is necessary to do both. If we don't, we risk seeing a repeat of what happened in 1937. Our country had been making great strides toward a full economic recovery. Production was up, wages were up, unemployment had come down from over 25% when Roosevelt took office to 14% in 1937. So after his landslide election in 1936, President Roosevelt, upon the advice of his Treasury Secretary, declared the Depression over. His Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, was getting uneasy about the long string of deficits that they had been running. To reverse course, they cut federal recovery program spending and raised taxes. This decision proved to be premature. The economy's impressive growth rate of the previous 4 years, it grew 11% in 1934, 9% in 1935, 13% in 1936, 5% in 1937. It came to a screeching halt, and the economy took another dive. The unemployment rolls increased by 5 million people, up to 19%. The economy shrank by 3.4% in 1938. And the country's remaining economic indicators remained low until the beginning of World War II. We shouldn't make the same mistake twice. We should continue investing in our future instead. But some colleagues are skeptical of this approach and talk about the United States as if we were Greece. Let me be clear, we are not Greece. If you were to take a look at interest rates on United States Treasury bonds, you would see that a 10-year Treasury is yielding just about 3% in interest. That's the market's pricing. If the market really thought U.S. Treasuries were risky, the market would demand more than 3.09% interest on a 10-year Treasury. The market says, we're not Greece. Yet the threat for taking some of the measures that Greece has recently taken is very real. Cutting back on spending now will jeopardize our economy and could push us into a double-dip recession. That would drive up unemployment even more, drive small businesses under, and stop us from growing out of the deficits that we all want to eliminate. Growing our economy is how we have come out of far worse deficits in the past. Now, at the end of World War II, our budget deficits had reached over 30% of our GDP, but we grew out of it. Today, it's just over 10% of our GDP. After World War II, the publicly held debt was 109% of GDP, compared to OMB's projection that will be at 64% by the end of this year. We grew ourselves out of it, and we can do it again. Destimulating our economy at this fragile moment is simply not wise. But don't take my word for it. Burton Malkiel, a member of President Ford's Council on Economic Advisors, said in 2003, if there is any time in which one ought to have a deficit, it is a time where there is economic slack and a job market that is not recovering. Manuel Johnson, one of President Reagan's Assistant Treasury Secretary, said he didn't think short-term deficits have much to do with the economy's performance. And Reagan's chief economic advisor, Martin Feldstein, was also one of our most distinguished conservative academics, was one of the strongest voices for robust stimulus legislation last year. Let's keep going. Michael Boskin, advisor to President George H.W. Bush, said, the notion that deficits are bad is way too narrow. Deficits can be a serious problem over the medium and long term. There are times it's good to see the deficit worsen or the surplus turn into a deficit. And he means those times, he means during an economic downturn. The chair of President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, Gregory Mankiw, said, it is a textbook principle of prudent fiscal policy that deficits are an appropriate response in times of war and recession. And earlier I mentioned one of Senator McCain's campaign advisors, Mark Zandi. He said that it's typical to run large deficits during a recession, and the true problem is persistent large deficits. So to my colleagues who refuse to enact anything that adds a penny to the deficit, what else can I say to convince you? Short-term deficits during a recession are acceptable. In fact, many of the conservative economists advising Republican presidents and presidential candidates have said they are prudent and even good. When we distinguish between short and long-term deficits, we start to paint a very different picture. Now, I don't want anyone to hear me to think I'm saying that we should just spend, spend, spend. Everyone agrees that we are on a track that is unsustainable. Without significant changes to policy, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities projects that our national debt could grow to 300% of GDP over the next 40 years. It's almost 3 times as large as the post-World War II level. The problem must be addressed with a careful, measured, and multifaceted approach. The same approach that balanced our budget just 10 years ago. As you can see here in 2000, we were running a surplus of $200 billion. And we were headed down the path to eliminating completely the publicly held debt. In fact, our debt could have been paid off today, by today, if no changes had been made to federal spending policy. But President Bush and Congress did make changes when they took over in 2001, like passing massive tax cuts for the wealthy, and as a result, our national debt more than doubled under President Bush. In January 2009, when President Obama was just taking office, CBO estimated that he was left with a $1.2 trillion deficit for the fiscal year, and the residual effects of ill-advised economic policies. Let's take a look at this chart, which shows our current 10-year budget outlook. As you can see, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities project there will be 5 major contributors to the deficit in 2019. The one that's obviously least under our control is this, which is the economic downturn. That's the red. Then there are the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's the green. That proportion is pretty substantial. But here's this little blue, kind of turquoise line. That's this little thing, that's the Recovery Act. This is legislation that is targeted over and over and over again for being such a huge contributor to our deficit. This sliver is what so many of my colleagues complain about, that one. Most of its contribution to the deficit is clustered right here in the first 2 years when the economy most needed a boost. But its longer-term budget deficits are tiny compared to its effectiveness in keeping us from falling into another Great Depression. And when compared to this yellowish-orange block, the block responsible for over $7 trillion in debt over this 10-year period. These are the Bush-era tax cuts, which were passed without being paid for. This block is the result of an experiment in economic theory. I think the record is clear that the experiment failed. But no matter what you think of the effect of that policy choice on our economy, you cannot deny the effect of that policy choice on our deficit, because here it is in yellowish orange. So when my colleagues come down here to rail against the Recovery Act, to blame the Recovery Act for increasing the deficit, well, I guess it can be technically accurate. A little bit of the blame, this much, maybe, I don't know, a centimeter. That goes to the Recovery Act, even though it very possibly kept us from slipping into a second Great Depression, in which case deficit's much larger. But I also want the American people to have a sense of how much of the blame should go to the Recovery Act and how much of it belongs elsewhere, and I think you see it. Now, this chart is gives you a good idea of where all the debt came from. As you can see, the debt accelerates upwards with President Reagan and President George H.W. Bush, and smooths out under Bill Clinton, and then spikes, skyrockets under George W. Bush. As I mentioned before, President Obama was left with a projected $1.2 trillion deficit in his first year in office. However, even though this massive debt was handed over to us by our last president, it doesn't diminish our responsibility to address it. I'm glad to see that so many of my colleagues also appreciate the seriousness of this responsibility, and some are proposing common sense solutions to bring these long-term deficits under control. We took a major step earlier this year by passing comprehensive health care reform. Healthcare costs were the #1 factor contributing to long-term government deficits. The cost curve on those were out of control. Under previous policies, the cost of Medicare and Medicaid would have gobbled up a third of the total federal budget by 2030. But healthcare reform included reforms, such as the value index, that will finally provide incentives for providing high-quality care at a lower cost, like we do in Minnesota, instead of providing the most expensive care possible without regard to outcomes. This legislation alone will have an enormous impact on the long-term deficit. The CBO estimates it will bring down the deficit by $143 billion in the first 10 years, and even more in the following decade. That's hundreds of billions of dollars. And that doesn't even include the reduction of private costs to families that will result from the improvements in the overall efficiency of our healthcare system. Now, these are CBO numbers, the same CBO whose numbers I quoted earlier about the alarming size of projected future deficits if we take no action. The exact same alarming numbers that my friends on the other side of the aisle quote. They're quoting CBO. If you want to rely on those CBO numbers, well then CBO numbers are what we must rely on to score health reform. I strongly support the health care reform bill we passed, and I'm optimistic about the positive changes that it will bring to the lives of millions of Americans, including bringing down our deficit. Now let's look at our tax policy. As recently as 1980, the top bracket for very wealthy in this country was 70%. And for 2 decades prior to that, the wealthiest Americans had income tax rates between 70 and 90-some percent. Today, it's 35%. These declining rates on the wealthiest Americans mean that more tax revenue is coming from middle-income earners. And this is during a period when the gap between those at the top and those in the middle has grown substantially. On top of that, we've allowed the estate tax to expire completely in 2010. This is a tax that affects less than 0.5% of all Americans. Now, my colleagues across the aisle will argue that the estate tax punishes our most productive members of our society, the children of the extremely wealthy. And this gift to our most fortunate sons and daughters costs the rest of us $14 billion this year alone. That tab for that $14 billion in lost revenues from America's multimillionaires and billionaires will be passed to all of our kids. And not just the $14 billion, but the interest on it as well. I think Teddy Roosevelt put it the best. He said, "The man of great wealth owes a particular obligation to the state because he derives special advantages from the mere existence of government." Those who want to eliminate the estate tax understandably don't put the children of the incredibly wealthy in their campaign literature. Instead, they talk about family farms as if family farms have been lost to the estate tax. Yet, according to the New York Times, the American Farm Bureau Federation was unable to name one family farm lost because of the estate tax. And opponents of the tax insinuate that it's impossible to design a policy that continues to protect the family farms that might be even slightly effective. Yet it is, of course, quite possible to do that. I've co-sponsored a reasonable approach to estate tax reform offered by Senators Sanders, Harkin, and Whitehouse. It retains the 2009 exemption limits, $3.5 million per person and $7 million per couple, with a progressive tiered structure so that the ultra-wealthy pay more. And yes, it makes provisions for family farms. This proposal will help ease the burden of middle-class families who are now expected to close the budget gap. Working families are also on the hook for the corporate welfare that's compounding the national debt. Our tax system is riddled with loopholes, so corporations can escape liabilities by shifting operations overseas. In fact, corporations are often actually rewarded for sending jobs overseas by our tax system. That has to stop. And there's something even more offensive. If BP is taken to court because of their negligence in this oil spill, and a judge finds that they owe punitive damages, those punitive damages can be deducted as a business expense. Why do we allow these oil giants who've earned hundreds of billions of dollars in profits in the past decade to deduct punitive damages from the taxes that they should pay? And that's if they pay taxes at all. ExxonMobil didn't pay any taxes last year. Despite its $45 billion profit, it paid no income tax. I don't bring this up to inspire anger at corporations. I bring it up because these loopholes and allowances create revenue shortfalls. Revenue shortfalls equal deficits unless they are shifted onto the backs of middle-class families paying taxes. But we would be remiss to go after these big oil companies without also tackling our own spending problems. Secretary Gates has led the way to explaining how we can and must achieve savings in the defense budget. While nothing is more important than the defense of our nation, national security is not well served by unnecessary, incredibly expensive weapons programs, nor are we well served by programs that come in late and way over budget. Secretary of Defense Gates recently quoted his predecessor, Secretary Rumsfeld, who said it best. Quote, "A person employed in a redundant task is one who could be countering terrorism or nuclear proliferation. Every dollar squandered on waste is one denied to the war fighter. That was Secretary Rumsfeld on September 10th, 2001. Our national security priorities must be matched to our real defense priorities in the 21st century, not dictated by expensive weapon systems that are only benefiting the bottom line of big defense contractors. These are all things that we can do to bring down long-term deficits. We urgently need bipartisan solutions. One idea that I supported, a deficit reduction commission, was proposed by Senators Conrad and Gregg. This commission would make recommendations that would then come up for an up or down vote here in Congress. That proposal failed. Despite its broad bipartisan support, the commission was ultimately supported by more on this side of the aisle than by those across it, including those who co-sponsored the original bill and then voted against it when it came up as an amendment. I'm curious what changes could be made to such a proposal to attract more support. I welcome working with my colleagues across the aisle to find such an approach. We're all agreed that the current path forward is unsustainable, but we differ on what changes need to be made. It is economically unsound and potentially dangerous to require that all spending be offset while we're still recovering from a recession, reeling from nearly 10% unemployment rates and looking for ways to temper the jobs deficit of 12 million workers. We're putting our economy back at risk just when it finally is turning a corner. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz has warned that the upcoming phase-out of the Recovery Act spending and state and local spending cutbacks, that they are likely to exert further downward pressure on the economy. Our working and middle classes are still struggling, and they continue to need our help. We can help them by extending unemployment insurance and COBRA subsidies for those who lost a job through no fault of their own. We can retain vital nutrition assistance programs in the Recovery Act to make sure that kids don't go hungry. And we can make investments in renewing our nation's infrastructure. These aren't government handouts. They're the most effective ways to get our economy going again and contribute to our economic recovery. Without these measures, we risk slipping back into a recession, and as I've noted, recessions directly contribute to long-term deficits. I encourage my colleagues to join me in standing up to the rhetoric that all spending is created equal. I encourage my colleagues to show compassion toward those still out of work. I encourage my colleagues to support spending programs that will help us emerge from this downturn. And I encourage my colleagues to join forces in coming up with new ways to tackle our long-term deficits because they matter. We face enormous economic problems, the short-term economic crisis and the long-term deficit. But we also face a seemingly intractable political problem. As long as this body refuses to face up to the simple facts about where our deficits came from and what we need to do to solve them, as long as we turn a blind eye to the simple facts about what will get us out of this major downturn, we will be unable to reach the solutions demanded by these problems and deserved by the American people. Simply put, if we don't face facts, we can't do our jobs. And that would leave this country in serious trouble. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.